You can imagine the reaction of Trump to Hillary. Who should be Trump here? I believe that, I mean, we made a point. Yes, I completely agree with Greg. We need to ensure that the graph we showed earlier on in moving the population based on the estimated average requirements for specific micronutrients, move our population to the right, shift them in such a way that they would have access to adequately fortified staples. Now, significant importance in ensuring that quality is ensured, right from the industry, through the distribution chain, to the final consumer at the household level. We need to capacitate our governments to be able to enforce the standards that have been established for specific levels of micronutrients in fortified staples, whether it's produced locally or imported into the country. This will require enormous capacity reinforcement, both in training and also in terms of materials and equipment for analysis. And I think this is one of the key challenges that we are facing in most African countries. We have standards that are existing, but they are not being enforced. And this is not only particular to fortification, but a lot of other standards. And most of the time when products are directed to European or US markets, if they do not comply to safety standards, they are transferred to African markets because they know our systems are weak. Not only that, even if they are analyzed and they are found not to comply, corruption is a major challenge that we are contending with by the custom officers and those who are supposed to enforce the law. So we have huge challenges to be able to make food fortification work effectively in ensuring that we have the required amount of micronutrients that are in fortified staples reaching the final consumer. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I feel like the dietary diversity interventions that are being implemented around the world are very important. The question I have around a lot of different nutrition interventions is, when we have limited resources, what do we invest in? And especially in countries where we know we can make an immediate change today, or say within a year's time, if we start to fortify adequately, according to WHO standards, those vehicles which can't be fortified, versus putting all our eggs in one basket around a 15-year plan, which might only affect the population 15 years down the road. And I think that's where the debate is, because you have donors, you have governments with limited resources that have to make very, very difficult decisions, and how do you optimize those decisions to say we're going after some short-term and medium-term wins without neglecting the longer-term wins, which I do believe are often more around dietary diversity and behavior change.
Now, in fact, I was going to throw back that question back to Greg, because he's supposed to be the expert on fortification here. So where do we invest?
When I watched the debate between Trump and Clinton, I did not see Hillary throwing it back. Well, going back to the argument that if you believe what the international economists are saying, and they do these meta-analyses of the cost of development projects, fortification comes out number one in terms of cost effectiveness and cost benefit. I think if you really do have limited resources and you have a clear need of micronutrient deficiency that needs to be addressed, and you have a clear pathway forward for delivering fortified foods, I do believe it's a wise decision to invest then your limited resources in food fortification, because of the simple fact that it works and it's cost effective. However, we have to follow through with the commitments. And I think the big need today in fortification, as you have pointed out, is that 85 countries have mandated grain fortification. But if you look under the hood, how many of those 85 countries are doing it well? And there's some data showing not a whole lot, unfortunately. It will take time. And it's not to blame government or industry, but there is a lot of work to be done to make sure those 85 countries implement better.
That is the very reason why we cannot say it's a panacea. And I believe that the willingness is there by government. That's why most of them have mandated it. The cost effectiveness is unquestionable, as you rightly said. For example, for every dollar you invest in fortifying staple foods, the outcome could be as much as $32 in terms of preventing deficiencies. So definitely, it's a very cost-effective investment. And Copenhagen Consensus statement have actually validated the argument that if you have priorities of investment, economic investment to make, it's good to invest in addressing micronutrient deficiencies, supplementation and fortification at the top of those interventions. Now, the question also is, if we are taking the classical approach to food fortification, if we do not change the way we are doing business, then we could continue to invest so much but not see the concrete results. And that is why it is very important for us to have an integrated approach. For me, I don't see why we should be having, for example, social marketing around a fortified staple and a logo without communicating on behavior change when it comes to dietary diversification, care practices, exclusive breastfeeding, appropriate for the first 6 months, and appropriate breastfeeding, appropriate complementary food with continued breastfeeding thereafter. We need to have this integrated way of doing things so that we can have the maximum impact on the population.
Okay, so we're still having quite a bit of agreement. What I would like to do now is open to the floor for questions. I've already got some hands up, 5 hands. I think it was a gentleman in the blue shirt first, and then the lady in the white cardigan.
Thank you so much. I have 2 questions for you. The first question is regarding the advocates for the fortificants. I think one of the issues is in African context, we eat what we produce. And many people live in rural context, and in terms of reaching the community using fortified foods is a challenge. So the first question is, what is the vehicle of delivery that you promote as an advocate for fortificant? And the second question is, how is it going to be sustainable? Because many questions that will come is it sustainable? The third is, in many countries, there is no a policy environment that supports really food fortification to be, reachable for all, as well as, enforce policies so that the manufacturers can also produce fortified foods to reach most of the population. For the diet diversity, we know what we eat. So what we eat does not have, the nutrients that really meet the micronutrients required for, growth, development, and also building our communities. Especially in rural contexts, many of the foods are cereal-based. And others are, the foods that we eat have little sources from the animal product. I know that this is a sustainable way, but do we really, if we continue this way, can we really achieve you know, the cutting micronutrient malnutrition in the region, using what we are currently taking.
That's a question about implementation.
Okay, just briefly on the choice of vehicle and how you reach communities, I think I'll summarize your question in that way, the first part of your question. I think the choice of vehicle is critical, obviously, and you have to make sure that a good consumption survey is done up front, maybe a fortification rapid assessment, to see what are the foods that are being consumed, and also how are they delivered, how are they processed, because as we've mentioned, central processing is quite critical. I think small-scale fortification is promising, but not proven yet. So you need large-scale industry that can fortify these vehicles. And also, you might not want to put all the micronutrients in one particular vehicle, because then the cost might become, the margins might become quite high. So you might want to look at the choice of vehicle on cost, on how is it processed, and also the organoleptic issues. You know, for example, you wouldn't easily put iron into vitamin A. You know, a fat-soluble fortificant is needed for that. So you need to look at those three, I think, to make a good decision on the choice of the vehicle. And then on reaching the community, yeah, in some cases, the large-scale industry is not penetrating into rural communities, but as we're finding, industries are consolidating, for better or worse. Small scale in some countries is mitigating. There's less and less small scale industry, which means the consumption of these large scale, centrally processed foods are reaching deeper and deeper into rural areas, which the good news, whether or not you like that message, the good news is the food is more fortifiable and can reach it.
Sorry, I can just see there's a lot of people wanting to ask questions, so do you mind if I just...
I just wanted to add a bit to what Greg has provided us answer to the question. Looking at the sustainability question, you see the beauty about food fortification is that once you make it mandatory through some legislative framework, the industries would now have to invest in procuring the micronutrient premixes and adding it to the food. So it's a public-private partnership, and the different sectors would have to play their roles. That is, the government would have to spell out the rules of engagement for private sector to comply. Now, if you have industries that do not have confidence in the regulatory system in terms of enforcing those standards, none of them will comply. Because you do not expect one company to be buying the micronutrient premixes and be fortifying them, and then you are bringing in non-fortified staples when the rules of engagement stipulates that all vegetable oil or all cereal flour should be fortified to specific levels of micronutrients. Now, even within fortification, you have several different approaches to fortification. So you have home fortification, you have mass fortification, that is the large-scale industry fortification, you have biofortification, and you also have the use of sprinkles at the household level. So we could have an integrated approach even to fortification to ensure the sustainability. So I think by way of answer to your question on sustainability, those should be able to get addressed.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the presenters. I just have two questions about fortification, especially the food vehicles for fortification. You talked about oil, salt, and maize. And when I look at maize in Uganda, most of course, people grow maize within the communities. And you find that, yes, our colleague talked about they grow what they eat. And we have so many millers within the community who mill for these farmers what they grow. So my question is, do you expect these farmers within the local communities to actually sell off the maize they have milled and then go and buy the fortified maize? If you found those challenges, well, how have you addressed them? And then how are you regulating this? Or how do you expect the small millers within the communities to be regulated in order to make sure that actually the maize they have is fortified?
I'm not sure if in Uganda, the legislation stipulates that small scale is excluded from the mandatory legislation. But I know in many countries it is. Informal industry, cottage industry, artisanal, hammer mills, etc., are often excluded from that mandatory requirement to fortify. And where it is, that's for good reason. The government can't regulate that informal sector. And to be frank, I don't think it's easy for these small-scale mills to be able to procure the premix. It often comes in large drums. Where do they go to get it? And also to add a small margin onto the cost of the small-scale production might be difficult for the consumer to purchase. It has worked in a few places where there's been subsidy, where there's been donors backing it. Groups like ANEC have done a lot of small-scale fortification. But my own view, and I'm happy to hear others, is that small-scale fortification is not easily regulated, and therefore is outside of the purview of large-scale mandatory fortification programs.
And to just add to that, also the issue on quality and safety is also a challenge at that level. And so once you have one or two industries that cover maybe 70 to 80% of the population, it is better to focus on those, ensuring that those industries do it and do it well. Then you'll be reaching a significant proportion, because at the end of the day, we cannot reach 100% of the total population. So it's good to leave out the small scale where the context is not appropriate.
We have time just for one last question, which is
mine is not a question, but it's a comment. And I'm Beatrice Ekesa. I work with University International. And I had Greg mentioning something about fortification being a long-term thing. What are some of the short-term interventions that you can look at? And I'm looking at the diversity of species that we have around us. And some of them are very diverse, very nutritious, and could supply some of these micronutrients that we're looking at. For instance, someone talked about Uganda, where we have more than 1,000 banana accessions. But some of these varieties have not been explored. Some of them have very high values that could supply nutrients that equate to some of these biofortified products. So what are we doing to try and study some of the existing varieties that would provide some of these options that can be fast-tracked and used in our diets, rather than investing so much and coming up with these products which take some time? So we could think about fast-tracking some of the varieties that we have and having them with the farmers as we work towards some of these long-term approaches.
I tried to pass this to my colleague, but he gave it back to me. But no, I think I'm all for that. I think biodiversity is fantastic. Diverse diets, absolutely. I'll just answer like this. Very interesting. Two examples. In the U.S., I have friends that everything they eat is organic, and I mean they spend a fortune on their food. But she needs iodine supplements because she's unable, unless she eats a tremendous amount of kelp, or kale, to get the natural iodine in her diet. Similarly, in Switzerland, I was telling somebody today that traditional diets, if we went back to traditional diets in Switzerland, we wouldn't get enough iodine. That's just one example, because it's an alpine country and it's not in the soils. So I think we have to be very, very careful that even in countries where we have, a lot of dietary diversity, a lot of biodiversity in our diets, it's not necessarily adequate in translating to adequate intakes of essential vitamins and minerals. I'm hopeful it will be, as we get better at optimizing what's on our plate. But I think we have to be realistic too. We have to look at the full range of opportunity to ensure people get intake that's essential of essential vitamins and minerals that is adequate.
Sorry, we have to conclude there. So I think just very quickly summing up, it seems we can see a role for food fortification, supplementation, and the promotion of dietary diversity. They're all complementary interventions with short, medium, and long-term solutions really to micronutrient deficiencies. And I think one of the main messages is the importance of good implementation, and that applies to all three of those. And for those of you who were at the presentation yesterday of the Society of Implementation Science in Nutrition, I think actually reinforces the importance of putting some of our research efforts into the implementation now. Okay, so if you have any more questions, you're very welcome to come talk to us individually. And I'd just like to finish by thanking very much the panel for discussing this. And they look like their friends are going to shake hands at the end. Okay. Thank you everyone for staying.
Symposium on the subject of nutrition dynamics in Africa, opportunities and challenges in meeting the Sustainable Development Goals. We have two eminent speakers. You are already familiar with Professor Prentice, Professor Andrew Prentice of the Medical Research Unit of the Gambia, and the head of the Medical Research Council Unit of the Gambia, and head of the Medical Research Council International Nutrition Group at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine in the UK. The second speaker, who will respond to the first speaker, is an economist. It's Dr. Patrick Detzel, leader of the Health Economics Group at the Nestle Research Center, Lausanne, Switzerland. Dr. Prentice, you have the floor.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you to all of you who have cut your lunch short and come back. So I'd also like to thank Nestle for facilitating this meeting, which is a very interesting one to me, as I'll explain to you in a second, and for inviting me to participate in it. Now, I want to add to my title, Harnessing the Economic Transition in Africa in a Nutritionally and Environmentally Sustainable Way. So I'll just reiterate the case that there is going to be a massive economic transition in Africa in a second or two. That's going to happen, God willing, unless we have another massive global crisis. But that transition will happen, and the key challenge for us is to try and harness the strength and vigor of that and direct it in a most positive way in terms of human health and development. Now, it's important at a session like this that I give you my disclosures. I teach on the annual Nestle Nutrition Institute pediatric course every year, which is a huge pleasure, a wonderful course. I'm a member of the Academic Advisory Board for Nestle's United for Healthier Kids, also a fantastic institution. If any of you haven't seen some of the work they're doing, do have a look on the web, just Google U4HK. And I'm a board member for the Nestle Nutrition Institute. So, this economic transition we're talking about, what evidence do we have that it's going to occur? Incidentally, I should have said I'm going to whiz very quickly through a few thoughts here. This is not a major presentation. Well, we have the Asian economic tiger, and we're going to be following that up with the African lion, we might say. So there are two recent summaries of the economic growth trends in Africa. You'll see on the right-hand side there that the economic GDP growth rate, that actually was a forecast at the time, but it's not looking a bad forecast, is going well. It hasn't actually overtaken Asia, as you can see on the middle part there, where you see emerging Asia and the Middle East are just above Africa, but it's doing well, and the trajectory, the presumed trajectory, is that it will be doing better than Asia soon. Now, an important corollary of this, both a consequence and probably a driver of this, is Africa's urbanization. And we all know about that from our personal experiences, but the numbers really are quite amazing. In 1990, 197 million Africans lived in urban areas. That more than doubled by 2015, so that now the estimate is 472 million, and by 2020 that will be 560 million, which means that there will be more people living in cities in Africa than any other continent apart from Asia by 2020. And that has both advantages and disadvantages. What all of this means is that life is changing radically. People used to move around like this, these kids on a 10-mile walk to and from school each day, and now they attempt to move around like this. And we have the problems that this causes, both in terms of major pollution, clogging up of our cities, but also in terms of sedentary behaviors. People used to work like this, and now they'll be sitting in offices or working remotely or having much lower levels of physical activity. The whole supply chain is changing massively. This is the shop where I get my morning bread every morning in Kennebar, and it's full of the most basic products, including Nestle's Maggie, of course, but it's full of really basic products. But importantly, the number of products being sold there is changing week by week. They are able to stock more and more products because even in these rural areas,